The industrial dishwasher hissed behind me like an angry beast, belching steam that made my skin sticky beneath my uniform. My lower back throbbed with that deep, bone-level ache that came from standing for 7 hours straight on tile floors that offered no mercy. The scent of fryer oil clung to my hair, my clothes, probably my soul at this point, mixing with the sour tang of spilled beer and the artificial pine of whatever cleaning solution Marcus insisted we use on the bar top. I glanced at the clock above the kitchen pass. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until my shift ended. 13 minutes until I could catch the last bus toward campus, collapse in my dorm room for exactly 4 hours, then wake up for my morning classes. The math of my exhaustion was precise, calculated down to the minute, because that's what survival required when you worked 2 jobs while pursuing a nursing degree. "Aaliyah, table 9 needs their check," Marcus called from behind the bar, not looking up from the pint glass he was polishing with mechanical precision. His voice carried that particular tone of thinly veiled impatience he reserved for the evening shift, when the crowd thinned out, and he just wanted everyone gone so he could lock up. I nodded, reaching for the check pad, even though my fingers felt swollen and clumsy. The Red Lion pub wasn't fancy, just a dimly lit Boston bar that catered to a rotating cast of locals, grad students slumming it away from campus, and the occasional businessman too tired or too drunk to care about ambiance. The exposed brick walls absorbed sound, creating pockets of conversation that never quite reached across the room. Red vinyl booths lined one side, scratched wooden tables filled the middle, and a jukebox in the corner played the same rotation of classic rock that had probably been programmed in 1987. Table 9 was in the back corner, the booth I'd privately nicknamed the shadow seat, because the overhead light had burned out weeks ago, and Marcus never bothered replacing it. The man who always sat there fit the darkness perfectly. I'd noticed him the first night I started working here 3 weeks ago, noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't belong, like a wolf in a dog park. He came in every Thursday and Saturday, always alone, always ordered the same thing: vodka, neat, and whatever soup was on special. He never looked at his phone, never read a paper, just sat with perfect stillness that should have been peaceful, but instead radiated something that made my instincts whisper warnings I couldn't quite articulate. Tonight he wore charcoal gray, a suit jacket that probably cost more than my entire semester's tuition, though he'd removed his tie and unbuttoned his collar in the only concession to relaxation I'd ever seen him make. His watch caught what little light reached his table, platinum or white gold, definitely not something you bought at a mall kiosk. Dark hair swept back from a face that looked carved from something unforgiving, all sharp angles and harder planes, with gray eyes that tracked movement with the precision of a security camera. I'd served him 6 times now, and he'd never once smiled. Never made small talk beyond thank you, delivered in an accent that turned the words into something formal and distant. Most customers either ignored me or tried too hard to be friendly. He existed in some third category I couldn't name, treating me with a careful politeness that felt more like protocol than courtesy. I grabbed the check and a tray of dirty glasses from table 7, balancing both as I navigated between tables. The pub had emptied out significantly in the last hour, just Shadow Man and 9, a couple of grad students nursing beers at the bar, and a group of nurses from Mass General winding down from their shift in booth 3. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket as I moved. Probably my roommate Keisha asking if I needed her to save me dinner. The distraction lasted only a second, just long enough for my shoe to catch on something. A napkin on the floor. My own exhausted feet. Divine intervention designed to humiliate me, and suddenly I was pitching forward, the tray tilting at an angle that defied physics. I crashed directly into table 9. The glasses hit first, sliding across the polished wood surface with a sound like wind chimes made of disaster. I followed, my hands slamming onto the table to catch myself, my hip connecting solidly with the edge. The check fluttered down like a defeated surrender flag, and my face came to rest approximately 6 inches from the chest of the most dangerous-looking man I'd ever accidentally assaulted. Time did that strange thing it does in moments of absolute mortification, stretching out so I could fully experience every aspect of my failure. I could feel the heat flooding my cheeks, smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of cedar and leather that had no business smelling that good. His shirt was soft beneath my palm, where I'd instinctively reached out to steady myself, and I could feel the solid warmth of him beneath the fabric, muscle that didn't give when I pushed. "Oh my God!" I gasped, scrambling backward so fast I nearly tripped again. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't see. My foot caught. I wasn't looking where I was going." The words tumbled out in a rush, my nursing school composure completely abandoned in the face of having just face-planted into a customer. I bent to gather the scattered glasses, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and embarrassment, fully expecting him to demand to see the manager, or stand up and leave without paying, or do literally anything other than what he did, which was nothing. He sat completely still, his expression unchanged. Those gray eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Not angry, not irritated. Just watching me with the same careful attention he probably gave to everything. Only now it felt different somehow. Like I'd crossed some invisible boundary and triggered a sensor I didn't know existed. "I'll get you new drinks right away," I continued, still babbling, gathering the last glass and straightening up, trying to restore some shred of professional dignity while my heart hammered against my ribs. "And the soup? I'll make sure it's hot. Marcus always lets things sit too long under the heat lamp. You're bleeding." His voice cut through my panic, low and controlled, with that accent that turned simple words into something almost formal. He gestured toward my hand, and I looked down to see a thin line of red welling up across my palm, where I'd caught myself on the table edge, probably on a rough spot in the wood. "Oh," I said intelligently, staring at the blood like it belonged to someone else. "That's not your fault. The table has this splinter thing. Marcus keeps saying he'll sand it down." He stood up, and my words dried up completely because holy hell he was tall. 6'3" at least, with shoulders that filled out that expensive suit jacket, in a way that suggested the body beneath was no stranger to physical labor, despite the corporate costume. He moved with fluid precision, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a handkerchief, actual fabric, pressed and folded, the kind of thing I associated with old movies and British aristocrats. "Here." He held it out, and when I just stared at it, too stunned to react, he took my wrist with his other hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm but careful, turning my palm up to examine the cut. "It's not deep, but you should clean it." I was acutely aware of his touch, the way his thumb rested against my pulse point, the clinical efficiency with which he assessed the damage. He wrapped the handkerchief around my hand with practiced ease, and I found myself wondering about a man who knew how to bandage wounds, but wore suits that cost thousands of dollars. "I can't take your handkerchief," I protested weakly, even as he finished securing it with a neat tuck. "It's probably expensive." "It's fabric," he interrupted, a hint of something that might have been amusement flickering across his expression before disappearing. "Replaceable." He released my wrist and settled back into his seat, resuming that perfect stillness like our entire interaction had been a minor interruption in his evening rather than the most mortifying moment of my recent life. His vodka sat untouched, his soup cooling in its bowl, the check lying where it had fallen near his elbow. "I'll still get you fresh everything," I said, gathering the tray and the soiled glasses, trying to reclaim some fragment of competence. "And I'm really sorry about crashing into you. Long shift. You work 2 jobs." It wasn't a question, but his tone invited confirmation. I paused, surprised he'd noticed enough to deduce that. "Yeah, here and at the campus bookstore. Nursing school doesn't pay for itself." Something shifted in his expression, so subtle I almost missed it in the dim light. Not quite interest, but something adjacent to it, like I'd said something that registered on whatever internal calculation he was always running. "That's commendable," he said, and the word sounded genuine despite his formality. Not many people your age would be willing to work that hard. Not many people my age have to, I replied before I could think better of it, then winced at how bitter that sounded. Sorry, that came out wrong. I just mean, student loans are no joke. No need to apologize. He picked up his vodka, swirled it once, set it down without drinking. Honesty is rare enough to be valuable. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and headed back toward the bar, my palm throbbing where the handkerchief pressed against the cut. Marcus looked up as I approached, his eyes narrowing at the makeshift bandage. What happened to you? I tripped into table 9, I admitted, setting down the tray with more force than necessary. Made a complete fool of myself. Marcus's expression shifted into something between concern and warning. That's Viktor Malenkov. You know who that is? I shook my head, already reaching for a fresh set of glassware. The name meant nothing to me. He's someone you don't want to piss off, Marcus said quietly, leaning closer. Owns half the commercial real estate in this neighborhood. Very private, very particular, and people who cross him tend to have bad luck. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the pub. I glanced back at table 9, where Victor sat in his pool of shadow, apparently unbothered by having been assaulted by a clumsy waitress. He didn't seem angry. That's what makes it worse, Marcus muttered. The ones who don't show anything are the ones you really need to watch. I made fresh drinks, got a new bowl of soup from the kitchen, and brought everything back to table 9 with careful steps that had nothing to do with coordination and everything to do with the new weight of awareness pressing against my shoulders. Victor accepted the items with a nod, and when I set down the check again, he said, "Keep the handkerchief. Consider it payment for the entertainment." I must have looked confused because he added, "You're the first person to touch me in 12 years. That's worth a piece of fabric." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward with implications I couldn't begin to process. Before I could formulate a response, he placed cash on the table, far more than the bill required, and stood to leave. 12 years? I heard myself ask, the question escaping before professional caution could stop it. He paused, and for just a moment, something human flickered across his features. Pain, maybe, or the ghost of it. 12 years, he confirmed. Until tonight. Then he walked out, leaving me standing in the dim light of table 9, holding his handkerchief like a puzzle piece I didn't know belonged to a much larger picture. I showed up for my next shift still thinking about Viktor Malenkov's parting words, turning them over in my mind like a Rubik's Cube I couldn't solve. 12 years. Until tonight. What did that even mean? I'd crashed into him, not performed some kind of mystical healing ritual. Thursday night at the Red Lion brought its usual crowd, locals claiming their favorite stools at the bar, a bachelor party taking up 3 tables and ordering enough wings to feed a small army, and the grad students who treated the place like an extension of their campus library, nursing single beers for hours while their laptops glowed in the darkness. I tied my apron with practiced efficiency, checked my reflection in the clouded mirror beside the kitchen entrance, dark coils of hair pulled back into a bun, foundation barely concealing the exhaustion in my brown skin, lip gloss applied more out of habit than hope, then grabbed my order pad and stepped into the familiar chaos. Marcus caught my eye from behind the bar, jerking his head toward the back corner. Table 9. My stomach did a complicated flip that I refused to examine too closely. Victor sat in his usual position, the booth's shadow falling across him like a shield, but tonight something was different. The untouched vodka still sat before him. The bowl of soup still cooled uneaten. But his posture had shifted fractionally. Less fortress, more something I couldn't quite name. He was looking at the door when I approached, tracking movement with those gray eyes that never seemed to blink. "Evening," I said, attempting professional normalcy despite my pulse's sudden acceleration. "Same as usual." You kept it. His gaze dropped to my hand, where his handkerchief peeked out from beneath my sleeve. I'd washed it carefully, pressed it with my roommate's iron, carried it with the intention of returning it tonight. Of course, I replied, pulling it from my pocket. It's yours. He made no move to take it. I told you to keep it. And I'm telling you I can't accept expensive gifts from customers. I set it on the table between us, a small square of white fabric that somehow felt like a negotiation. But thank you for lending it to me. The cut healed fine. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to catch. He reached out and pushed the handkerchief back toward me with one finger. It was my wife's. I'd prefer someone use it rather than let it sit in a drawer gathering the dust of memory. The word wife hit like an unexpected wave. I stared at the handkerchief, suddenly seeing it differently. The careful embroidery in one corner that I'd assumed was his initial, now clearly an E for someone else entirely. Was? I asked softly, the question inappropriate but somehow necessary. She died. He said it simply, factually, the way you might report the weather. 12 years ago. Cancer. The pieces arranged themselves into a picture I wished I didn't understand. A man who lost his wife, who stopped letting people close enough to touch him, who sat alone in dark corners drinking vodka. He never finished. I'm sorry, I said, inadequate words that I meant anyway. That must have been unbearable. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Surprise, maybe, that I'd acknowledged the weight of it, rather than offering empty platitudes about time healing wounds, or her being in a better place. It was, he agreed quietly. It still is, in different ways. I should have taken his order and walked away. Should have maintained the professional distance that Marcus's warning had emphasized. But something in his voice, in the careful way he held himself like a man made of glass pretending to be made of stone, made me pull out the chair across from him and sit down. Tell me about her, I said. Victor stared at me, and I watched several expressions cross his face in rapid succession. Shock, confusion, something that might have been longing, and finally a bone-deep wariness. Why would you want to know? Because you've been sitting here alone for weeks and nobody's asked, I replied. And because pretending that grief doesn't exist doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes it lonelier. The words came from my own experience. I'd lost my grandmother 2 years ago, the woman who'd raised me after my parents decided parenting was too much work. The nursing program had taught me about death in clinical terms, but it was Gran's passing that taught me how grief could hollow you out, while leaving you perfectly functional from the outside. Victor was silent for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Elena. Her name was Elena. He spoke for 20 minutes, words spilling out like they'd been dammed up for years. He told me about meeting her in Moscow, how she'd been a violinist with the symphony, how she'd laughed at his terrible attempts to understand classical music. He told me about her diagnosis, about trying to save her with every resource his considerable wealth could buy, about holding her hand as she slipped away in a private hospital room overlooking the Charles River. She made me promise, he said, his voice roughening, that I would live after she was gone. Not just survive, but live. And have you? I asked gently. His laugh was hollow. I built an empire. I made more money than 5 generations could spend. I controlled everything I could control. He looked at his hands, at the wedding band he still wore on his left ring finger. But living? No. I stopped doing that the day she stopped breathing. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine, a simple gesture of comfort that I'd done 1,000 times with patients, with grieving families, with friends who needed to know they weren't alone. His skin was warm, his fingers stiff with surprise beneath my palm. "She wanted you to live," I said softly. "Maybe start small. Eat your soup before it gets cold. Actually taste what you're drinking. Talk to the annoying waitress who keeps crashing into you." He turned his hand over, palm up, and his fingers curled around mine with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his intimidating exterior. "You're not annoying." "Give me time," I replied, attempting lightness. "I'm very skilled at becoming annoying. It's a gift." The corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "I believe that." Marcus cleared his throat loudly from the bar, and I realized with a start that I'd been sitting at Victor's table for nearly half an hour. The pub had filled up around us, tables needing attention, drinks waiting to be delivered. I reluctantly pulled my hand back, though the warmth of his touch lingered on my skin. "I should get back to work before Marcus fires me," I said, standing. "But Victor, she was right. You should live." Over the following weeks, something shifted between us, subtle but unmistakable. Victor still came in Thursday and Saturday nights, still sat in his shadow booth, but now he actually ate his soup, actually drank his vodka, and most significantly, actually talked to me. He asked about my classes, listened with genuine interest as I complained about organic chemistry, and described the thrill of my first successful IV insertion during clinical rotation. He told me stories about Elena, about growing up in Moscow, about the strange duality of running legitimate businesses, while everyone whispered about his other connections, the ones he never confirmed or denied. "People think I'm dangerous," he said one night, swirling vodka in his glass. "They're not entirely wrong. I think you're lonely," I countered, refilling his water glass. "Which is different from dangerous, though I suppose the two aren't mutually exclusive." "You're not afraid of me." He said it like a discovery, like he was still processing the novelty of it. "Should I be?" His expression grew serious. "There are people who would say yes, people who would be wise to fear me. But I'm not one of them," I said firmly. "You've never given me a reason to be afraid. You've been nothing but respectful and kind, even when I literally fell on you." "You surprised me," he admitted. "No one surprises me anymore, Aaliyah. I've built my entire life around control, around knowing exactly what will happen before it happens. And then you came stumbling in with your apologies and your warmth, and your complete lack of awareness about who I'm supposed to be." "And who are you supposed to be?" I challenged. He smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. "Someone much less human than you make me feel." I started bringing him extra food, the soup that was too rich to serve but perfect for a cold Boston night, the bread that came out of the oven just a little too dark, but tasted better for it. When I noticed him rubbing his temples one evening, I brought him aspirin without asking. When he mentioned offhand that he hadn't read for pleasure in years, I brought him a dog-eared copy of my favorite mystery novel. "You don't have to take care of me," he said, accepting the book with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I'm studying to be a nurse," I replied. "Taking care of people is literally what I do." "This is different." His eyes held mine, and I saw something in them that made my heart skip. "You know it is." I did know. Somewhere between the accidental collision and the intentional conversations, between the grief he shared and the laughter I coaxed from him, we'd crossed a boundary neither of us had intended to approach. I noticed things I shouldn't notice, the way his jaw clenched when he was stressed, the rare moments when his accent thickened with emotion, the fact that he timed his arrivals to the moments when my shift began and lingered until I clocked out. And he noticed me, not just as a waitress or a convenient audience for his isolation, but as a person. He remembered that I took my coffee with too much sugar and not enough cream, that I was afraid of failing my pharmacology exam, that I hadn't been home to see my family in North Carolina in over a year because I couldn't afford the bus ticket. "How much is a bus ticket to North Carolina?" he asked one night, his tone carefully casual. Don't, I warned. Don't even think about it. Think about what? Whatever you're thinking about. I leaned against the booth, exhausted from a double shift. I don't need rescuing, Victor. I'm doing fine. You work 16-hour days and survive on cafeteria food and 4 hours of sleep. His voice was gentle but firm. That's not fine. That's sacrifice. It's called being a broke college student, I countered. Everyone does it. Not everyone has a choice. The words hung between us, weighted with implication. I knew he could make my struggles disappear with a phone call, with the kind of money he probably spent on his monthly dry cleaning. I also knew that accepting that help would change everything between us, would shift the balance from something organic and real into something transactional. I need to earn this, I said quietly. The degree, the life I'm building, all of it. If someone just hands it to me, then it's not really mine. Understanding flickered in his eyes, followed by respect. I can appreciate that. But, I added, because his concern touched something tender in my chest, I appreciate you offering, more than you know. He nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He stood, reached for his jacket, and pulled out a business card. My personal number, not for money or favors, but because if you ever need help, the kind that doesn't compromise your independence, I want you to be able to reach me. I took the card, our fingers brushing in the exchange, a point of contact that sent electricity racing up my arm. Thank you. And Aaliyah? He paused, one hand on the booth's edge. For what it's worth, Elena would have liked you. She always said the strongest people are the ones who help others, even when they're barely surviving themselves. The compliment settled around my heart like a warm blanket. I wish I could have met her. In some way, he said softly, I think you already have. The parts of myself that I thought died with her, you've been gently reminding me they still exist. He left then, disappearing into the Boston night, leaving me standing in the dim light of Table 9, holding a business card that felt like a promise I wasn't ready to name. The first time I called Victor's number wasn't for help, exactly. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I couldn't sleep, because my mind kept replaying a clinical rotation from earlier that day. A young woman my age, maybe younger, bleeding out in the ER while I stood frozen, useless, watching the experienced nurses move with precision I didn't yet possess. My fingers found his business card in the drawer of my bedside table, the edges softening from how many times I'd touched it over the past week. I pulled up the number, told myself I wouldn't actually call, then found myself listening to the ringtone anyway. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. Aaliyah? The fact that he'd saved my number, that he knew immediately it was me, made something loosen in my chest. I'm sorry for calling so late. I shouldn't have... What's wrong? Concern sharpened his words into something urgent. Are you hurt? Unsafe? No, nothing like that. I curled into my thin dormitory blanket, suddenly feeling foolish. I had a bad day at clinical and I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I don't know why I called you. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. I heard movement on his end. The rustle of fabric. The soft thump of his feet hitting the floor. Tell me what happened. So I did. I told him about the young woman, about the blood and the fear and the desperate efficiency of the trauma team. I told him about feeling helpless, about questioning whether I was strong enough for this profession I'd invested everything into pursuing. Words spilled out of me in the darkness, all the fear and doubt I couldn't show anyone else because I was supposed to be capable, supposed to be strong. Victor listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, he said quietly, The fact that it affected you means you're exactly who should be doing this work. How do you figure? Because you care, he replied. In my experience, the people who should have power are the ones who understand its weight, who feel the cost of their decisions. The dangerous ones are those who act without consequence, who forget that their choices affect real lives. I thought about what Marcus had said, about Victor being someone you don't want to cross, about the whispers of his connections and the careful way people treated him. Do you feel the weight of your decisions? Silence stretched between us, long enough that I thought maybe I'd pushed too far. Then, every day, every single one. Was there ever a decision you couldn't take back? Something that haunts you? Yes. The word carried the weight of confession. Many. But the one that haunts me most is the decision I didn't make, choosing to do nothing when doing something might have saved her. Elena. He was talking about Elena. What happened? She wanted to stop treatment 6 months before she died, he said, his voice rough with old pain. The chemotherapy was destroying what little quality of life she had left. She begged me to let her go, to stop fighting, to just be with her while she still had some dignity. But I couldn't. I pushed for more treatments, more trials, convinced myself that one more month of suffering might buy us one more year together. I heard the crack in his voice, the place where grief had fractured something fundamental. You were terrified of losing her. I was selfish, he corrected. I chose my fear over her wishes. And in the end, she died anyway. But those last months, instead of being filled with music and laughter and the things she loved, they were filled with hospitals and pain and the bitter knowledge that I loved her too much to let her go gently. Tears slid down my cheeks in the darkness. Victor, that wasn't selfishness. That was love in its most desperate form. Love that hurt her, he whispered. That's what I carry. That's what wakes me at 3 a.m. Understanding crashed over me. This was why he answered on the second ring, why he was awake when I called. Because guilt and grief were insomniac companions, keeping vigil through the long hours when the world slept, and the mind wouldn't. Can I tell you something Elena knew that maybe you've forgotten? I asked softly. What's that? That you're human, that you made a choice from love, even if it was the wrong choice. That she forgave you before she died. I'd bet everything I have on that. Because people don't ask someone to live unless they've already forgiven them for not knowing how. His breathing changed, became uneven. I realized with a start that he was crying. This dangerous man who controlled empires and inspired fear, crying on the phone with a 24-year-old waitress he barely knew because she'd given him permission to be human. Thank you, he said eventually, his voice scraped raw. For calling, for understanding, for not letting me hide tonight. Same to you, I replied, for answering, for listening, for reminding me why this matters. We stayed on the phone for another hour, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about the restaurant he was opening in Back Bay, about his frustration with his business partners who couldn't see beyond quarterly profits. I told him about my dream of working in pediatric oncology, about wanting to be there for the Elenas and their families, to hold space for their grief and their hope in equal measure. You'll be extraordinary at it, he said with such certainty it made me believe him. How can you know that? Because you're extraordinary at being present, at making people feel seen. That's the hardest skill to teach, and you do it naturally. After that night, our calls became regular. He'd text around 2 a.m., a simple, awake? And I'd call him, or I'd text first, and he'd answer immediately. We existed in those stolen hours between darkness and dawn, when the rest of the world slept, and we could be honest about our fears and failures and the weight of choices we carried. Thursday night, when I showed up for my shift at the Red Lion, Victor was already there, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him in his booth, beautiful in that polished, expensive way that made me immediately conscious of my cheap uniform and flyaway hair. She wore a cream silk blouse, diamonds at her throat, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves, that probably required a professional and an hour of her morning. My stomach clenched with something I refused to name as jealousy. He'd never mentioned anyone, never indicated there was someone else sharing his life, though I realized with uncomfortable clarity that I'd never asked. I approached the table with my order pad, professional smile fixed in place. "Evening. What can I get started for you?" Victor's eyes met mine, and I saw something complicated in them. Apology, maybe, or discomfort. "Aaliyah, this is Natasha Volkov. We're engaged," Natasha interrupted smoothly, her accent matching Victor's, Russian vowels shaping English words. Her smile was pleasant, her eyes assessing. Victor has told me so much about this little pub. I finally convinced him to let me see it. The word engaged landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I forced my expression to remain neutral, to not show the sudden hurt blooming in my chest. "Congratulations. That's wonderful." "Thank you." Natasha placed her hand over Victor's, a possessive gesture that made me look away. "It's been a long time coming. Victor has been resistant to moving forward, but I've finally convinced him that Elena would want him to be happy." The casual invocation of his dead wife's name, the implication that Natasha knew what Elena would want, made something hot and ugly twist in my stomach. I looked at Victor, searching his face for some kind of explanation, but he'd retreated behind that careful mask I hadn't seen in weeks. "I'll give you a moment to look over the menu," I managed, already turning away. His hand shot out, catching my wrist with gentle firmness. "Aaliyah, wait. Your waitress probably has other tables," Natasha said smoothly. "We wouldn't want to keep her from her work." I pulled my wrist from his grip and walked away with as much dignity as I could muster, my vision blurring with tears I absolutely would not let fall. Marcus gave me a knowing look as I passed the bar, but had the grace not to comment. The rest of my shift was torture. I avoided table 9 as much as possible, sending Marcus to take their orders and deliver their food. Through the corner of my eye, I watched Natasha touch Victor's arm, lean close to whisper in his ear, laugh at things he said with practiced ease. She belonged in his world in a way I never could, polished and perfect, speaking his language both literally and figuratively. When they finally left, Victor caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," but I turned away, busying myself with clearing tables that were already clean. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later. His name on the screen made my heart clench. "We need to talk. Can I see you after your shift?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I don't think that's appropriate, considering you're engaged." His response was immediate. "It's complicated. Please, let me explain. Some things don't need explanation. Congratulations on your engagement, Mr. Malenkov. I hope you'll be very happy." I blocked his number before he could respond, before I could change my mind, before the tears that had been threatening all night finally spilled over and betrayed exactly how much I'd let myself care for a man who was never really available. The next 3 weeks were brutal. Victor came to the pub on his usual nights, always alone now, but I traded shifts to avoid him, picked up extra hours at the campus bookstore, buried myself in studying until my eyes burned and my brain felt like cotton. Keisha finally confronted me about it, finding me crying over an anatomy textbook at 2 a.m. "Either tell me what's wrong, or I'm staging an intervention," she said, sitting on my bed with her arms crossed. "You haven't been yourself since that night you came home looking like someone killed your puppy." So I told her everything. About Victor, about Elena, about our 3 a.m. conversations, and the way he'd started to feel like home. About Natasha, and the engagement I hadn't known existed. "Oh, honey," Keisha said softly, pulling me into a hug. "You fell for him." "I didn't mean to," I whispered against her shoulder. "I just wanted to help him, to be his friend. I didn't expect—" You didn't expect him to become important, she finished. That's how it happens, though. The ones who sneak past your defenses are always the ones you weren't trying to protect yourself from. He's engaged, Keisha. He was probably engaged the whole time, and I was just, what? A distraction? A cute diversion? Did he act like you were a diversion? I thought about our calls, about the rawness of his grief when he talked about Elena, about the way he listened to my fears like they mattered. No. He acted like I mattered to him. Then maybe this engagement isn't what you think it is, Keisha suggested. Maybe you should hear him out. But I was too hurt, too proud, and too aware of my own foolishness to reach out. I'd let myself believe that grief and loneliness could be mistaken for something deeper, that the connection I felt was mutual rather than one-sided. Then, on a Saturday morning when I was studying in the campus library, Victor found me. He looked terrible, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it, dark circles under his eyes that matched my own. He slid into the chair across from me without asking permission, his presence drawing startled looks from nearby students. "You blocked my number," he said without preamble. "You traded away all your shifts at the pub. You've been avoiding me for 3 weeks." "You're engaged," I replied, keeping my voice low and level. I was being appropriate. "The engagement is a lie," he said flatly. "A performance for the benefit of my business associates, who think I've been alone too long, that my grief makes me weak." I stared at him, trying to process his words. "What?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd never seen from him. "Natasha is my business partner's daughter. She's known since childhood that our families intended us to marry eventually. After Elena died, I made it clear that would never happen, that I had no intention of marrying anyone. But pressure from the organization has been increasing, concerns about my stability, my judgment." His eyes met mine. "They arranged for Natasha to return from Moscow, to make a public show of our relationship. I've been trying to find a way to refuse without starting a war." "Then why didn't you tell me?" My voice cracked despite my efforts to control it. "Why let me think?" "Because I didn't want to burden you with the complications of my life," he interrupted. "Because you've given me something pure and real, and involving you in the political machinations of my world felt like contaminating something sacred." "I'm not fragile, Victor," I said, anger and hurt sharpening my words. "I don't need you to protect me from truth. I'm a grown woman who can decide for herself what complications she's willing to accept." He leaned forward, urgency tightening his features. "I know that. I know you're strong and capable and extraordinary. That's not why I kept you separate from Natasha and the engagement performance. I kept you separate because I'm falling in love with you, and the thought of exposing you to the darkness of my life terrifies me more than anything has terrified me since watching Elena die." The library seemed to fall away around us, his words echoing in the sudden silence between us. "You're what?" "Falling in love with you," he repeated, quieter this time but no less intense. "I didn't mean to. Didn't think I was capable of it anymore. But you walked into my life, literally crashed into it, and suddenly I'm thinking about futures instead of just surviving the present. I'm laughing again, hoping again, feeling again. And it scares the hell out of me, Aliyah, because I failed Elena, and I can't bear the thought of failing you too." My hands were shaking, so I pressed them flat against the library table. "I'm not Elena. I'm not sick. I'm not dying. I'm not something fragile you need to keep in a glass case." "I know," he said, his voice rough. "But I'm still the man who chose wrong when it mattered most. What if I make the same mistakes with you?" "Then we'll deal with them," I said, surprised by my own certainty. "Together. That's what people do when they care about each other, Victor. They make mistakes, and they forgive each other, and they try again." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over mine, asking permission. I turned my palm up, and his fingers interlaced with mine, warm and solid and real. I need to handle Natasha, the expectations, all of it, he said. It's going to be messy and complicated and might take time. Can you wait? Can you trust me to navigate this? I thought about Gran, about how she used to say that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose damage aligned with yours, who understood your scars because they carried their own. I thought about Victor's grief, about the way it matched my fear of not being enough, of failing when it mattered most. Yes, I said, but on one condition. Anything. Stop trying to protect me from your life. Let me in, even the dark parts, especially the dark parts. I need you to trust that I'm strong enough to stand beside you, not behind you. Something broke open in his expression, relief and wonder, and a vulnerability that made him look younger somehow. Deal. But Aaliyah? Yeah? You're not falling, he said softly. You've already arrived. I'm the one still catching up to you. Victor wasn't exaggerating when he said handling the Natasha situation would be messy. What he hadn't mentioned was exactly how dangerous messy could become when the Russian bratva had expectations and you were the American waitress threatening them. The first sign came 3 days after our conversation in the library. I was walking home from my evening shift at the bookstore, cutting through the usual side streets that shaved 10 minutes off my commute, when a black Mercedes pulled alongside me. The back window rolled down, revealing an older man with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. "Miss Brooks," he said in heavily accented English, "a moment of your time." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs had locked in place. Fear and common sense warring over whether fleeing would make things worse. "I don't know you, but I know you." His smile was pleasant, which somehow made it more threatening. "I know you work at the Red Lion on Thursday and Saturday nights. I know you're studying nursing at Boston College. I know Viktor Malenkov has been spending a great deal of time with you, time that should be spent with his fiancée, his fake fiancée," I corrected before I could think better of it. The man's eyes narrowed. There is no such thing as fake when it comes to family obligations. Natasha is the daughter of my oldest friend. Her engagement to Victor was arranged before either of them was born. Your interference is, how do Americans say, very inconvenient. I'm not interfering with anything, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Victor and I are friends. That's all. Friends. He said the word like it was something distasteful. Perhaps you should be aware that Victor's friends have a tendency to experience unfortunate accidents. His last friend, a business associate who disagreed with certain decisions, is currently recovering from injuries sustained in what police called a random mugging. The threat was clear, wrapped in politeness like poison in candy. I forced myself to meet his gaze directly. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm informing you," he replied smoothly. "Victor has responsibilities, obligations that supersede any temporary affection he might feel for an American girl playing at nursing school. Be wise enough to step aside before you find yourself in a situation you're not equipped to handle." The window rolled up before I could respond, the Mercedes gliding away into traffic like a shark disappearing beneath dark water. I stood on the sidewalk, shaking so hard I had to lean against a building for support, pulling out my phone with numb fingers. Victor answered on the first ring. "Aaliyah?" "Someone just threatened me," I said, my voice emerging high and tight. "A man in a Mercedes, silver hair, said I should step aside before I have an unfortunate accident." His sharp intake of breath told me he knew exactly who I was describing. "Where are you?" I gave him the intersection, and he said, "Stay there. I'm sending protection. Do not move. Do not go anywhere alone. I'm coming to you right now." "Victor, I mean it, Aaliyah. Stay visible. Stay public. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He arrived in 12, pulling up in his own black car with two men I recognized from the pub, regulars who I now realized weren't regulars at all, but part of whatever security apparatus Victor maintained. He stepped out, and the controlled fury in his expression made the men in the Mercedes seem almost civilized by comparison. He pulled me into his arms without a word, and I went, letting his solidity anchor me while my fear finally found outlet in trembling I couldn't suppress. "I'm sorry," he murmured against my hair. "I'm so fucking sorry. This is my fault." Who was he? Dmitry Volkov, Natasha's father. His arms tightened around me. "He's trying to force my hand by making you a target. It's a classic tactic. Isolate someone by threatening what they care about." I pulled back to look at him. "What happens now?" "Now I make it very clear that touching you means going to war," he said, steel threading his voice. "And I end this engagement farce tonight. Consequences be damned." "Victor, if that causes problems for you—" "Then there will be problems," he interrupted. "But there's no scenario in which your safety is negotiable. None." He drove me back to campus himself, insisted on walking me to my dorm room, stationed one of his men in the lobby with instructions that I wasn't to go anywhere without an escort. Keisha took one look at my face and pulled me into the room without questions, though her eyes tracked Victor with obvious wariness. "He's not the danger," I told her after he'd left, "but apparently being near him is." That night, Victor called from somewhere loud, voices in the background speaking rapid Russian. "I've called a meeting with Dmitry and the other senior members," he said. "I'm making my position clear. Natasha and I will not be married. Any attempt to force the issue or harm you will be considered a declaration of war against me personally. Can you do that? Just refuse? I have enough power that they can't simply eliminate me without catastrophic consequences to their own operations," he replied. "What they can do is make life difficult, cut me out of certain opportunities, pressure my legitimate businesses, but that's manageable. You being hurt is not." I heard the cost in his voice, the weight of choosing me over relationships he'd maintained for decades. "Victor, I don't want to be the reason you lose everything you've built." "Everything I've built," he said softly, "feels hollow compared to what I've found with you. I spent 12 years building empires in the wrong places, accumulating power and money like they could fill the hole Elena left. But you, Aaliyah, you've reminded me what actually matters. Connection, honesty, being seen for who I am rather than what I control. Even if being with me makes your life harder? Especially then," he said. "Because you're worth fighting for, worth changing for, worth whatever consequences come from choosing you over their expectations." The meeting apparently went as poorly as could be expected. Victor showed up at my dorm the next evening looking exhausted, his knuckles scraped, his left eye showing the beginning of a bruise. I pulled him inside before Keisha could protest, sat him on my narrow bed, and retrieved the first aid kit I kept for clinical emergencies. "What happened?" I asked, cleaning the scrapes with gentle efficiency. "Dmitry took my refusal poorly," he said. "There was an altercation. I made my point." I pressed an ice pack to his eye, and he winced. "Your point being?" "That anyone who touched you would answer to me personally," he replied. "That I was done performing for their benefit. That they could either accept my decision or find themselves dealing with someone far less reasonable." "And they just accepted that?" He caught my hand, stilling my ministrations to look at me directly. "They accepted that I was willing to burn everything down to protect you. That kind of commitment, even from someone they view as emotionally compromised, demands respect." Over the following weeks, the consequences of Victor's choice became evident. Business associates who'd once sought his counsel now avoided him. Opportunities he'd mentioned disappeared without explanation. The legitimate restaurant he'd been planning to open suddenly faced permitting problems that everyone knew weren't coincidental. But he never wavered, never suggested that I should step back or that his decision might have been hasty. Instead, he showed up for my life in ways I'd never experienced. He attended my intramural volleyball games, cheering from the stands like I was competing in the Olympics. He quizzed me for exams using flashcards he'd made himself, his pronunciation of medical terms endearingly terrible. He brought me dinner during late-night study sessions. Real food, not campus cafeteria nutrition crimes. "You don't have to do all this," I told him one night, watching him set up a picnic on the library lawn because I'd mentioned missing eating outdoors. "I know I don't have to," he replied, spreading a blanket. "I want to. That's the difference. But you're losing things because of me. Opportunities, relationships. I'm losing things that were keeping me trapped in a life I didn't want," he corrected. "You've given me permission to choose differently, to build something real instead of just maintaining what others expected from me." I sank onto the blanket beside him, accepting the container of still warm pasta he'd brought from a restaurant I recognized as one of his investments. "I never intended to upend your entire life." "I know," he said, his smile soft. "That's what makes you different from everyone else who's tried to change me. You never wanted to change me at all. You just wanted me to stop pretending I was fine when I was drowning." "And are you?" I asked. "Drowning?" He considered the question seriously. Looking out at the campus stretched before us, students moving between buildings with the casual confidence of people who didn't yet understand how quickly life could shatter. "No," he said finally. "For the first time in 12 years, I'm learning to swim." The Natasha situation resolved itself with surprising anticlimactic efficiency. She called me directly one afternoon, asking to meet at a coffee shop near campus. Every instinct screamed trap, but curiosity and a stubborn refusal to hide won out. I agreed, telling Victor only after I'd already arrived. Natasha was waiting when I walked in, still perfect in designer clothes, but something had shifted in her expression. Resignation, maybe, or relief. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, as I sat across from her. I wanted to apologize. That was not what I'd expected. For what? For my father's actions, for allowing this farce to continue as long as it did, she replied. "The truth is, I never wanted to marry Victor either. I love someone else, have for years. But my father wouldn't accept that my fiancé wasn't Russian, wasn't connected, wasn't appropriate for his daughter." Understanding dawned. "You wanted out of the arrangement as much as Victor did." "More," she said with feeling. "But neither of us had the courage to refuse until you gave Victor a reason to. Your existence, your willingness to fight for him. It showed me that I could fight for my own happiness too. What will you do?" She smiled, and for the first time, I saw genuine warmth in her expression. "I'm moving to London with my actual fiancé CC. Father has already disowned me, but Victor has promised to help me disappear cleanly, to make sure my father's reach doesn't extend to my new life. So in a way, you freed both of us from expectations that were killing us slowly." After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for a long time, processing the strange reality that sometimes disrupting the status quo helped more people than just yourself. Victor had lost business connections but gained freedom. Natasha had lost her father's approval but gained her own life. And I had gained, what exactly? A man who showed up, who chose me despite consequences, who looked at me like I was the answer to questions he'd stopped asking years ago. It felt almost too good to be real, like something that would dissolve if I examined it too closely. My phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Heard you met with Natasha. Please tell me you didn't agree to duel her at dawn." I smiled despite myself. No duel, just clarity. "Where are you?" "My place." "Want to come over?" "I'll cook." I'd never been to Victor's home, had kept our relationship contained to public spaces and campus grounds, some instinctive need to maintain boundaries. But something about today, about Natasha's confession, and the way Victor had fought for me. made me ready to see where he lived when he wasn't performing for anyone's benefit. Send me the address. His apartment was in the North End, top floor of a converted warehouse with views of the harbor. The space was minimalist and masculine, all clean lines and neutral colors, but warmer than I expected. Books lined one wall, real books with cracked spines suggesting they'd been read multiple times. Photographs dotted the surfaces, pictures of Elena that he hadn't hidden away, pictures of a life he'd shared with someone else. You keep her here, I said, touching a frame that showed a younger Victor, with his arm around a beautiful woman holding a violin. I told you before, she's part of my story, he replied, coming up behind me. Pretending she didn't exist would dishonor what we had. Does that bother you? I turned to face him. No. It makes me respect you more. Anyone who tried to erase their grief to make a new partner comfortable would be someone who couldn't fully love either woman. He kissed me then, slow and careful, his hands cradling my face like I was something precious he was afraid to break. I kissed him back, 12 years of his isolation and my loneliness meeting in that moment of connection. I'm falling in love with you, he murmured against my lips. I know I said it before, but I need you to know I meant it. I'm not just grateful for your kindness or appreciative of your presence. I'm in love with who you are, your strength, your compassion, the way you charge into situations that frighten you because helping matters more than safety. I love you too, I whispered back, the truth of it settling around my heart. Probably have for a while now, since somewhere between the crashing into you and the midnight phone calls. He pulled me closer, and I let myself believe that this was real and possible and worth every complication. Because Victor was right. Some things were worth fighting for, worth the mess and the difficulty and the cost. And standing there in his arms, surrounded by evidence of his past while building something entirely new, I knew with absolute certainty that this was one of them. The change in Victor's world created ripples that reached further than I'd anticipated. What started as his refusal to marry Natasha evolved into something larger, a slow, systematic dismantling of the obligations that had defined his life for decades. He began pulling back from operations that required moral compromises, transferring legitimate businesses into his sole control, building distance between his name and activities he could no longer justify to himself. I'm not becoming a saint, he told me one evening as we sat on his apartment balcony, watching the harbor lights reflect on dark water. I can't erase what I've done or who I've been. But I'm done pretending that Elena's death justifies continuing down a path I chose out of grief, rather than conviction. What will you do instead? He traced patterns on the back of my hand, his touch absent-minded and intimate. Build something that actually matters. I've been thinking about your dream, working in pediatric oncology. There's no dedicated children's cancer research facility in Boston. Nothing that focuses specifically on the diseases that steal kids before they have a chance to become who they're supposed to be. Understanding bloomed warm in my chest. You want to start one. I want to fund one, he corrected. Use the money I've accumulated to create something that actually saves lives instead of just accumulating more wealth. Partner with hospitals, recruit researchers, provide grants for promising trials. He looked at me, vulnerability clear in his expression. I want to build something Elena would have been proud of, something you could be part of if you wanted, after graduation. The vision he painted was beautiful and terrifying in its scope. Victor, that would cost millions, tens of millions. I have tens of millions, he said simply. More than I'll ever need. What better way to use it than making sure other people don't have to watch someone they love waste away because treatment options are limited or non-existent? Over the following months, I watched him transform that vision into reality with the same focused intensity he'd once applied to building his empire. He hired consultants, met with hospital administrators, courted researchers who'd been trying to secure funding through traditional channels for years. The project consumed him in the best possible way, gave him purpose beyond just surviving each day. But not everyone approved of his transformation. Dmitry Volkov, in particular, viewed Victor's withdrawal from certain operations as betrayal worthy of punishment. The threats started subtly. Business permits that suddenly faced scrutiny, vendors who abruptly became unavailable, small obstacles designed to communicate displeasure. Victor handled them with patient determination, refusing to be drawn back into conflicts he'd decided to leave behind. But I could see the strain in the tightness around his eyes, the way his hand would unconsciously move to his phone whenever we were in public, checking for messages that might contain warnings. "I'm making you a target," I said one night after his security team reported another incident. Someone following me from campus to the bookstore, a black car that kept pace just long enough to be noticed. Maybe if I stepped back. No. His voice was firm, final. That's exactly what Dmitry wants, to isolate me by making you feel unsafe, by convincing you that loving me means living in fear. I won't let him win, and I won't let you sacrifice yourself to ease pressure he's deliberately creating. But if something happened to me because of your world... He pulled me into his arms, his embrace fierce and protective. Then I would burn his world to the ground. But Aliyah, listen to me. Dmitry is an old man clinging to power by maintaining fear. His influence is already weakening. My pulling back has shown others that it's possible to survive defying him. He's losing control, and he knows it. Does that make him more or less dangerous? More, in the short term, Victor admitted. Desperate men take risks they wouldn't normally consider. But I have protections in place, plans he doesn't know about. Trust me to keep you safe. I wanted to trust him, tried to trust him, but fear had a way of colonizing your thoughts, turning every shadow into a threat, every stranger into a potential danger. I stopped walking alone after dark, started taking ride shares instead of buses, checked over my shoulder with paranoid frequency that left me exhausted. The crisis came in February, during one of Boston's brutal winter storms that turned the city into a frozen obstacle course. I'd stayed late at the library to finish a research paper, lost track of time until I realized I'd missed the last campus shuttle. The rideshare app showed a 30-minute wait, and my phone battery was dying, so I made the stupid decision to walk the 1.5 miles back to my dorm through the storm. I'd made it 3 blocks when the black Mercedes appeared, sliding smoothly alongside me in the empty street. My heart seized as the back window rolled down, revealing Dmitry Volkov's weathered face. "Miss Brooks, get in the car." "I'm fine walking, thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my pulse thundered in my ears. That wasn't a request. His tone remained pleasant, which somehow made it more terrifying. "We have things to discuss, you and I. Business matters concerning Victor's recent decisions." I backed away, pulling out my phone despite its dying battery. "I'm calling Victor right now." "Your phone won't work," Dmitry interrupted. "We've been jamming the signal for the past block. Please don't make this difficult, Miss Brooks. Get in the car, we'll talk, and then you can return to your studies. Refuse, and my associates will force the issue, which would be unpleasant for everyone." 2 men had materialized from the snow, one on each side of me, close enough that running would be pointless. Fear clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to think, to assess. If I got in the car, I had no guarantee he'd let me go. If I refused, these men would force me, and screaming in a storm with no one around to hear seemed equally futile. "What do you want?" I asked, stalling while my mind raced through options. "To make you understand certain realities," Dmitry replied. "Victor is making choices that affect many people who've invested years in building what he's now attempting to dismantle. Your influence over him has become problematic. I'm offering you one opportunity to remove yourself from the situation before things become, let's say, irreversible. And if I refuse? His smile was thin, cold. Then you'll learn that in my world, we deal with problems permanently. The threat was clear. Leave Victor or die. I thought about running, about fighting, about screaming into the storm. Then I thought about Victor, about the life he was building from the ruins of his grief, about the research facility that would save children like the young woman I'd watched bleed out in the ER, about how letting Dimitri win meant dooming all of that, letting fear dictate the future. No, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I won't leave him, and you can't make me, not without starting a war you're not prepared to fight. Dimitri's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Miss Brooks. The only mistake, a new voice interrupted, is yours. Victor emerged from the storm like an avenging angel, 3 men flanking him, all armed, all radiating the kind of casual violence that made Dimitri's associates step back instinctively. He moved between me and the Mercedes, his presence a barrier more effective than any physical shield. You touched her, Victor said, his voice deadly calm. You threatened her. You tried to take her from me. I made her an offer, Dimitri corrected smoothly, though I saw his hand move toward his coat pocket. Business is business, Victor. You know this. Business doesn't involve my life, Victor replied. You crossed a line, Dimitri. The only question now is how you want this to end. What happened next occurred so quickly I almost missed it. Dimitri's hand emerged from his pocket holding a gun. Victor's man fired first, the bullet striking Dimitri's shoulder and sending him sprawling backward into the Mercedes. And suddenly the quiet street erupted into chaos. Victor grabbed me, his body covering mine as we hit the ground behind a parked car. Gunfire echoed off buildings, sharp cracks that barely registered above the wind. His security team returned fire, while Dimitri's men dragged their wounded employer back into the Mercedes, which peeled away with tires screaming against snow-slicked pavement. Then silence, broken only by my ragged breathing and Victor's whispered reassurances against my hair. You're safe. I've got you. You're safe. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Victor pulled me to my feet, checked me over with hands that trembled slightly, the only sign of his own fear. Are you hurt? I shook my head, unable to form words past the adrenaline crash that left me shaking violently. He wrapped his coat around me and guided me to his car, leaving his men to handle the arriving police with whatever story they'd prepared for moments like this. We drove to his apartment in silence. He settled me on the couch, wrapped me in blankets, made tea I didn't drink. Finally, he knelt before me, taking my cold hands in his warm ones. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough. I should have anticipated this, should have protected you better. He was going to kill me, I interrupted, the reality of it finally penetrating my shock. He was actually going to kill me. I know. Victor's jaw clenched. But he failed, and now he's wounded and exposed. He won't try again, Alia. Tonight was his last move, and he lost. How can you be sure? Because I've already set things in motion that will ensure it, he replied grimly. Dimitri violated protocols older than both of us, attempting to harm you, to start a shooting war on a public street. He's shown himself to be more liability than asset. The other families will remove him from power rather than risk the attention he's drawn. I wanted to believe him, but fear had settled deep in my bones. And if they don't? If he comes back? Victor pulled me into his arms and I went, letting his solid presence anchor me to something real and safe. Then I'll do what I should have done from the beginning. I'll remove him from the equation permanently, and I'll face whatever consequences come from that choice. But Alia, I need you to understand something. He pulled back enough to look at me, his expression serious. I would burn down everything I've built, sacrifice every connection and dollar and piece of power I possess, to keep you safe. You are more important than any of it. Tonight proved that, if proof was needed. "I don't want you to burn everything down for me," I whispered. "I know," he said gently, "but I want you to know that I would, so that you understand exactly how much you matter, how far I'm willing to go to protect what we're building together." The shooting triggered investigations that lasted weeks. Police questioned Victor, questioned me, questioned witnesses who'd materialized to provide statements that somehow exonerated everyone involved while making Dmitri appear to be a reckless aggressor. I suspected Victor had orchestrated much of it, calling in favors and influence to ensure the narrative matched his needs. But I didn't ask for details. Some things I was learning were better left unexamined. Dmitri disappeared shortly after being released from the hospital, his daughter confirming via text that he'd been quietly deported back to Russia, his assets seized by associates who'd lost patience with his volatility. Natasha sent her thanks along with the news, grateful that her father's removal meant she could finally live freely without fearing his reach. With the immediate threat resolved, life settled into something almost normal. I returned to classes and clinical rotations. Victor continued planning his research facility, bringing me into discussions about design and patient services, treating my input as valuable despite my lack of experience. Our relationship deepened, strengthened by having survived crisis together, by the knowledge that we'd both chosen each other, despite significant costs. One evening in April, as cherry blossoms bloomed across campus, and the city finally shed its winter cold, Victor showed me the architectural renderings for the Elena Malenkov Pediatric Cancer Research Center. It was beautiful. Glass and light, with patient rooms designed to feel like home, gardens where kids could play when they felt strong enough, family spaces where parents could grieve and hope in equal measure. "She would have loved this," I said, touching the rendering where they'd placed a music room for patients who wanted to play instruments during treatment. "I hope so," he replied quietly. "I like to think this is what she meant when she asked me to live, to build something meaningful from the rubble of losing her." I turned to him, this man who'd lost everything and rebuilt himself from grief into something better, who'd chosen love over fear, despite every reason to do the opposite. "I'm proud of you. For this, for choosing differently, for letting me in despite how terrifying that must have been." He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his entire face. Being terrified means it matters. I'm done running from things that matter. He dropped to one knee, and my heart stopped. He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple platinum band with a single diamond. "I know this is fast. I know we've been together less than a year, that you're still in school, that this is probably terrible timing. But Aaliyah, I've spent 12 years telling myself I'd never do this again. Never risk this kind of loss again. And then you crashed into my life and reminded me that love isn't just about risk, it's about possibility. So I'm asking, will you build a future with me? Will you be my wife?" I dropped to my knees beside him, cupping his face in my hands. "Yes. Absolutely yes." He slid the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly, like everything else between us. We knelt there on his apartment floor, holding each other while the city sparkled through his windows, two people who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful choice we can make is deciding to let someone in, to choose love despite its cost, to build something beautiful from the ruins of everything we'd lost. The Elena Malenkov Pediatric Cancer Research Center opened 18 months later, on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the night Victor first walked into my life. I stood beside him as he cut the ribbon, now Dr. Aaliyah Malenkov, having finished my nursing degree and immediately enrolled in the center's specialized oncology fellowship program. The building had transformed from architectural renderings into something even more beautiful, a space that felt like hope, made tangible. Children moved through hallways painted with murals, their laughter echoing off walls designed to absorb their joy rather than their fear. Families gathered in common areas that felt like living rooms, rather than hospital waiting rooms. Researchers worked in state-of-the-art laboratories where promising trials were already showing results that could change outcomes for kids facing impossible diagnoses. "She's here," Victor said quietly, his eyes on the portrait of Elena that hung in the main lobby, her violin caught mid-arc, her smile captured in oil paint. "I can feel her approval." "She's proud of you," I replied, taking his hand, "of what you've built from your grief." The past year and a half had been a whirlwind of change. Victor had completed his transition away from the shadowy aspects of his life, transferring final holdings to trusted associates while maintaining the legitimate businesses that funded this center and other charitable efforts. The process hadn't been without cost. Relationships severed, opportunities lost, people who viewed his transformation as betrayal. But he'd navigated it all with quiet determination, never wavering in his decision to build something that honored Elena's memory while creating a future with me. We'd married in a small ceremony 6 months ago, just us, Keisha as my maid of honor, and Victor's sister as his witness. No elaborate reception, no complicated guest list that would have required navigating old alliances and new tensions. Just 2 people choosing each other in front of a judge who'd raised her eyebrows at Victor's surname, but wisely asked no questions. "Dr. Malenkov," one of the staff nurses called from down the hallway. "We have a new admission in room 204. Parents are requesting to meet you." I squeezed Victor's hand once before heading toward the patient rooms, slipping into the role I'd trained for, the purpose that had driven me through sleepless nights and impossible exams. Room 204 held a little girl, maybe 7 years old, her head wrapped in a bright pink scarf, her eyes huge in her small face. Her parents sat on either side of the hospital bed, their expressions carrying the particular devastation of people who'd just heard their child had cancer. "Hi there," I said gently, approaching the bed with practiced warmth. "I'm Dr. Aaliyah. What's your name?" "Sophia," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's a beautiful name." I pulled up a chair, sitting at her level rather than looming above. "Sophia, I know you're scared right now. Your parents are scared, too. And that's okay. Being scared means you understand that something big is happening. But I need you to know something. This place, everyone who works here, we're all here to fight this thing with you. You're not alone." Sophia's mother started crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Her father gripped his daughter's hand, like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just tilted sideways. I knew that grip, had seen it countless times in the month since the center opened, that desperate clutching at something precious that suddenly felt fragile. "We'll start with more tests to understand exactly what we're dealing with," I explained to the parents, my voice calm and professional. "Then we'll develop a treatment plan tailored specifically to Sophia. The facility here is equipped with the latest technology, and our research team is working on trials that show real promise for her type of cancer. There's hope. I need you to hold on to that." I spent the next hour with them, answering questions, explaining procedures, providing the kind of comprehensive care that I dreamed about during those exhausted nights working double shifts while studying. This was why I'd pushed through, why Victor's support had mattered so much, so I could be here, in this moment, making a difference for a little girl and her terrified parents. When I finally emerged from Sophia's room, I found Victor waiting in the hallway, his expression soft with understanding. "How is she?" "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia," I replied. "Treatable, especially with the new protocol Dr. Chen is testing. She'll be here for a while, but her prognosis is good." He pulled me into his arms, and I let him, drawing strength from his steady presence. "You're extraordinary at this. Elena would have loved watching you work." "I had a good teacher," I replied, looking up at him. "You taught me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that we can build something meaningful from loss if we're brave enough to try." Over the following months, I settled into the rhythm of the center, working with children at various stages of treatment, celebrating victories when tumors shrank or blood counts normalized, holding space for grief when treatments failed and families had to say goodbye. Victor was there through all of it, funding expansions, approving research grants, occasionally visiting patients who asked to meet the man whose wife had inspired the place, saving their lives. We built a life that honored both Elena and the future we were creating together. Victor kept her photographs in our home, spoke about her freely, made sure the center's mission reflected her values. I learned to see her not as competition, but as the foundation upon which Victor's capacity to love had been built. The woman who'd taught him that connection was worth the risk of loss. One evening, nearly 2 years after the center opened, Victor found me in Elena's memorial garden, a space we designed with benches and flowers where families could process their emotions away from the clinical environment. I was sitting alone, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Rough day?" he asked, settling beside me. "Lost a patient," I admitted, my voice rough from crying. 4 years old, name was Marcus. We'd been treating him for 6 months, and nothing worked. His mother's screams when we called time of death. I couldn't continue, the sound of that mother's anguish echoing in my memory. Victor pulled me against his chest, his arms secure around me while I fell apart in the way I couldn't allow myself to do in front of patients' families. "I knew this job would be hard," I said eventually, wiping my face. "I knew there would be losses, but knowing it intellectually and experiencing it are completely different things." Elena used to tell me that the hardest part of loving deeply is accepting that you can't control outcomes. Victor said quietly, that all you can do is show up fully, give everything you have, and trust that your presence matters even when you can't change the ending. I pulled back to look at him. "Is that what you did? With her?" "Eventually," he replied. "Too late to make her last months what they should have been. But I learned the lesson, even if I learned it in the worst possible way." "I'm glad you're here," I said softly. "I don't know how I'd do this job without you to come home to." "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he replied. "But I'm glad you don't have to do it alone." We sat in silence as darkness fell around us, the memorial garden's soft lighting creating pools of illumination that felt sacred somehow. Other families drifted through, some supporting each other, others sitting in solitary grief, all united by the shared experience of loving a child facing impossible odds. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked suddenly. "Leaving your old life? Building this center? Choosing this path?" Victor considered the question seriously before answering. "No. The life I had before was about accumulation, about building power and wealth to fill a void I couldn't acknowledge. This life, with you, building this place, it's about contribution, about using what I have to actually matter. That's not a sacrifice, Alia. It's a gift." 3 years after the center opened, we achieved our first significant breakthrough. A treatment protocol developed by our research team showed a 90% survival rate for a specific type of childhood leukemia that previously had been considered largely incurable. The news spread through pediatric oncology circles like wildfire, bringing recognition and funding that allowed us to expand our research into other childhood cancers. Victor watched the celebration from the sidelines, his expression peaceful in a way I'd never seen during those early months when grief had made him hollow. Later, in our home overlooking the harbor, he pulled me close and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For crashing into me," he said, that rare smile transforming his face. "For refusing to let me hide in my grief. For showing me that it was possible to live again, to build something meaningful, to love without betraying the memory of what I'd lost." "You did that yourself?" I countered. "I just happened to be the catalyst." "You were everything," he corrected softly. "The reason, the motivation, the proof that risking connection was worth the fear. I spent 12 years convinced that loving again meant betraying Elena's memory, that the only way to honor what we'd had was to remain frozen in grief. And then you came stumbling into my life with your warmth and your strength, and your complete refusal to see me as anything other than a man who needed a friend. You needed more than a friend, I said, touching his face. You needed someone to remind you that you were still alive, still capable of building and dreaming and loving. I found that someone, he replied, kissing me with a tenderness that still made my heart race even after years together. The best mistake you ever made was sending that text to the wrong number, or maybe it was exactly the right number all along. I thought about that night, about the humiliation of crashing into his table, about the 12 years of isolation he'd built around himself like armor, about how grief and loneliness had shaped both our lives until we'd collided and shattered those protective walls. Maybe there are no wrong numbers, I said. Maybe some connections are just waiting for the right moment to happen. Poetic, he murmured against my hair. But I prefer to think it was fate, or Elena's intervention from whatever comes after, pushing me toward someone who could teach me that life continues even when it feels like everything ended. Years passed. The center expanded, adding wings and programs and researchers whose work saved more children than I could count. I became the director of pediatric oncology nursing, training new nurses in the same compassionate care that had defined my own practice. Victor stepped back from day-to-day operations, trusting the team we'd built to continue Elena's mission while he pursued other charitable ventures. We built a life that wasn't about erasing pain, but about transmuting it into purpose, about honoring loss by creating meaning from its lessons. Victor kept Elena's violin in our home, occasionally running his fingers along its strings without playing, remembering. I kept Gran's recipe box, cooking her dishes when homesickness struck, connecting to her through food and memory. And sometimes, late at night when the city slept around us, Victor would pull me close and say the same thing he'd said that first night we met. You're the first person to touch me in 12 years, and I would respond the same way every time. Then I'm honored to have been the one who reminded you that being touched, being seen, being loved, that all of it was worth the risk of breaking again. Because in the end, that's what love requires. The courage to break, the strength to build from those broken pieces, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes the most beautiful things emerge from ruins we thought would destroy us. Victor taught me that grief doesn't end, it just transforms. And I taught him that transformation doesn't require betraying the past, only honoring it while embracing the future. We built our future together, one patient at a time, one breakthrough at a time, one quiet evening at a time where we chose each other despite every reason to remain isolated and safe. And in that choosing, in that constant decision to show up for each other and for the children whose lives depended on the center we'd created, we found something that had eluded both of us before. Not just survival, not just grief managed, but actual living. The kind of living that Elena had asked Victor to do, that Gran had wanted for me, that we'd finally learned to do together. Our broken pieces fitting together in ways that made us both more whole.